So, I'm Susan Dzieduszycka-Suinat. You can all call me Susan. I'm President and CEO of Overseas Vote Foundation and U.S. Vote Foundation, and also your host for our event today. It's an honor to accompany you through our journey of Summit 23. You'll notice that we have a new presentation system, and it's like taking a long walk together through the day. This event brings together a diverse and passionate mix of minds and talents. When we come together at Summit to interact and exchange new ideas, we also create and expand a very powerful network of people. People who ultimately want to improve the voting process for our citizens. At OVF, we have a 3D strategy of development, data, and dialogue. We believe this builds an environment conducive to positive electoral reform. The development relates to our technical program, data clearly to our research program, and dialogue is for this annual Summit conference program. The Summit, we believe, is a means for dialogue which is crucial to building the network of people. Thank you all for taking this day to focus on our electoral challenges, defining them, analyzing them, hearing various points of view. But before I go further, I think some thank yous are in order. You'll see and hear from some important members of the OVF team today. Without them, OVF and US Vote really could not happen. Here are a few faces that you'll see. I'd also like to recognize the organizations and people who make this day possible, our sponsors. Behind each of these logos is an incredible organization doing good work and caring for the cause. Thank you to Global Touch, a strategic consulting group. They're serving the IT industry. Thanks to Bear Code, which does all of our design, our web design and program work. Thank you to the OSDV Foundation. Greg Miller is here today with his group of social entrepreneurs, and they're working to create an open source digital voting technology. Democracy Live, a special thank you to them. They've been a consistent sponsor. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to announce a new agreement with Democracy Live. You'll see a press release in your packets today, and we're happy that Democracy Live will become an exclusive reseller of the OVF-hosted systems. Brian Finney and his colleague, George Monroe, will be in the audience, and you can talk to them more about it as you please. We're also excited to see a new sponsor, the Forest Marsh Group. They are an applied research company, and they're working now with the FVAP on a sequel to the Overseas Citizens Vote Count initiative. We also have our friends at FedEx. They do a lot with us. It's really immense. The Express Your Vote program ran again for the third general election from 94 countries, shipping ballots back at very good rates. I certainly also want to thank Runbeck Election Services on the back of these beautiful research reports and all of this beautiful printed material. Here's their logo. We're thanking Runbeck for the beautiful work they've done to make all that you have in your hands possible. Okay, moving on. We've got a power-packed agenda. It's going to give us a good kickoff into this next election cycle. Each year, we try to vary the agenda and the speakers. And we work to build the audience, to bring in new people. This year is no exception. Hopefully the snow doesn't keep too many of them away. But this year also our theme is expand the conversation. We invite you to do that with us. That's what Summit's about. That's what makes the value of Summit. Elections are a core of our democracy. We've been conducting elections for over 200 years. You really wouldn't think there would be so many surprises. But it never gets dull. More people vote than we expect. Voting methods change. New technologies emerge. We hear different points of view on how to conduct elections. It's really an evolving art, science, industry, scholarship. Each time around, there are also turning points. We'll never forget Bush versus Gore in 2000, or the emergence of the HAVA Act, and now the MOVE Act. And then recently, we all heard the words declared across our nation, "We have to fix that." When I heard those words, I knew it would set the election community on fire. It really put everyone back in the hot seat. But it's also very exciting for us. If you ever worried that you had a boring career, well, I'm sure you're relieved. Now, anyway, we're in the phase of analysis of what actually really truly happened in the 2012 election. You'll be hearing some of that analysis today, and wherever you look, I'm sure you'll see things that can be improved. These things may not be new, but we're here because we know that in running elections, we're constantly adapting. So how do we stay ahead of the curve? I can't give you all the answers, but we're here to kick off the process together. We focus on a few key areas in this summit that we think should be part of the fix. Before I go further, since I still have the mic, and I'm up to bat here first, I'll start this off by showing you a bit of what we did at OVF and US Vote in 2012. First of all, despite the concerns voiced about a downturn in turnout, for OVF, 2012 was a record year. We welcomed over 1 million visitors to our websites. Of the 1 million visitors, nearly 190,000 of them used our OVF or US Vote voter registration and absentee ballot request tools. The completion rate was over 85%, resulting in 160,000 completed applications. The star sites were New York and Minnesota, who together had over 200,000 visitors to their state-level UOCAVA websites. Across all the OVF sites combined, 20% of the voters were first-time voters. They're really going for those online services. There was no gender gap in the use of the OVF site, and 26% of the users were under 25. That's a big change for us. And that's the student vote right there. 2012 was really a different sort of year. We not only launched US Vote Foundation, bringing state-specific absentee ballot requests online to voters across 50 states, but we also had the opportunity to work closely with 5 states and counties fulfilling requirements for the federal EASE grants. Those were Ohio, New York, Maryland, Minnesota, and Okaloosa County, Florida. We updated all of our sites' interfaces, keeping them fresh, and we put in place new sites, for example, for Bernalillo County, New Mexico, and our first US Vote hosted site for the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities. We also launched Voto Ausente USA, and we remodeled the back-end reporting dashboard so that all of our licensees can see what's happening on their sites in real time. We did some great projects with the state of Minnesota. In addition to creating a new What's on My Ballot application, which is very sweet, we also developed a federal write-in absentee ballot that actually reads in state and local candidates, as well as ballot initiatives and judicial races. It's really the ballot for all seasons and all reasons. But what was really fun with Minnesota, I'm going to show you later, it's an educational answer to helping voters complete the absentee ballot process. So exciting things were also happening in other places around the country. With Okaloosa County, we developed the first OVF mobile application, which will be launched out over other sites over time. And also with them, we developed an online data transfer program, bringing us toward online voter registration. So now we'll have to stop with this fun part, but I've given you a taste of some of the things we've done this year. And with that, I'd like to transition to our opening keynote speaker. As I'm sure you know, absentee balloting is very close to our hearts here at OVF and US Vote. It's a voting method that increasing numbers of voters are choosing. And it's true, also, alongside that it's something of a lightning rod topic. Believe me, in my position, I feel it, but I've been there before. The goal of US Vote, I assure you, is not to make all voting into absentee voting, but it is to improve absentee voting so it can be the best it can be. For many voters here in the US, as well as overseas and in the military, absentee voting is the ideal option. And we do want people to vote. We do want them to have that option. We are delighted to introduce many of you today to Dr. John Fortier, who's not only the director of the Democracy Program at the Washington-based Bipartisan Policy Center, but he's also a political scholar, a commentator, and a commentator, I meant to say, for all the major news networks from CNN to PBS. You've probably also seen his articles in The Hill or Politico. Among his many works, John's book on absentee and early voting, written after the 2004 elections, spells out the advantages as well as the risks of these forms of voting. John astutely predicts the trends, and he must feel like something of a savant after the last two presidential elections. He also points out that the growth in absentee balloting has been a silent, state-by-state, incremental process without much of a national debate. If there's a time for debate, this is it. It's here, and it's now the year of we have to fix that. What better person to start it off than the author himself? And with that, I bring you Dr. John Fortier.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for having me here. I can't see any of you because it's very bright, but I've seen some of you earlier, and I know this is a great crowd on a cold, snowy day in Washington. I'm really delighted to speak here. I want to say something up front, that I am very much an advocate of improving the process for voting overseas, for voting absentee for people who need it. But you'll see from my talk and my recounting of the history that I went through in writing my book that, I am a bit of a skeptic on the expansion of absentee voting domestically. That there are different ways of going. There are early voting in person, which I tend to favor more. But I do see a role, obviously, for absentee voting will be part of our system for those who need it. Now, how did I get to where I'm going to end up? I wrote a book back in 2006 looking back at the trends of voting early, voting absentee, and saw that we really started to add up to significant numbers of people who were voting before Election Day. And this hadn't always been the case. And so how did that come about? And here's a brief history of when we started to vote absentee, what were some of the concerns, and when we started to have our most recent trend. You can go back and look and find some obscure laws in the early 1840s or 50s on state books that there were some possibility of voting absentee here and there, but it's unclear what happened. But there was a big effort to vote absentee by mail or somehow remotely during the Civil War. Obviously, this is the time where a large percentage of the male population who could vote at the time is away from home. The stakes are high in the elections. And there are significant debates within each state as to what to do. Fortunately, we had a young 18-year-old soldier from Vermont who later went to become an eminent historian, and later in life, in his 70s or so, looked back at that period and went through in great detail. So any of you want to read 400 pages of the debates in the Civil War about absentee voting, there's a book called Voting in the Field, which I recommend, and there are probably 3 copies around in the country on that. Simply put, there was a lot of thinking about what the promises of this vote are, how to do it, all sorts of variations of proxy voting, ballots that would be transmitted, finding ways to get soldiers back to other parts of the state, voting in other locations that they might not vote in. But after the Civil War, this essentially died out, and the laws expired. These were strictly limited to military voters. And we didn't really see much of it until the beginning of the 20th century. But interestingly, in that time period, after the Civil War and leading up to the beginning of the turn of the century, we saw another major set of reforms in American democracy. And I think the way these two reforms interacted really shaped the way that we used to vote by absentee. And that reform was the move to the secret ballot, or the so-called Australian ballot. The more cartoon version of the excesses of the time would be that if you were in a city where the city boss controlled your livelihood, you might work for the city, you might depend on the patronage of that party, you would bring your own ballot to the polls. It was often a color-coded ballot, blue or red. You would march through the polling place and put it into a glass jar where everybody could see that you had voted for the appropriate party. And then you could be rewarded by your party, punished if you went the other way, and the abuses and the lack of the secrecy, the lack of the privacy, the coercion that went on in American politics became a national issue. We didn't reform that process nationally. We did it on a state-by-state basis, but over a course of 20 years or so, states moved very strongly to the elements of the Australian ballot. The government prints the ballots. You don't make your own. That there's a privacy place somewhere that no one can know how you voted. And this was, of course, changed in practice, but also written into state constitutions, that there was a right to a private right to a secret vote. Now, having passed all of these reforms, the polling place changed. In fact, interestingly, political scientists will note that when you look at the voter turnout statistics from that period, as it is, voter turnout tended to go down after these reforms. Maybe there were fewer fraudulent votes. But early in the 20th century, we started to become a much more mobile society. Railroad workers were abroad. That was one out of state, out in the West, building the railroads. That was one category of people which caught the notice of some states. There were reasons why people were moving around more, and states started to recognize this and say, there should be a way for people to vote who really have to be away from the polls, who cannot get to their home place. And it started slowly, state by state, class by class. Again, some of these early laws are railroad workers may vote early, people who are sick, people who can provide a reason that they are away from their locality on business. And again, there were some variations. Sometimes you could vote in another polling place within the state. Sometimes you had to mail in the ballot. But classes of people were developed. But how would you square this reform with the earlier reform of the privacy of the ballot? Now there's a piece of paper that potentially anybody can see. Somebody might be able to coerce your vote, see how you're voting. And so states really put into place the best they could of privacy protections for the voter. And now not so common or starting to fade away, but the first time I voted absentee, which was when I was in college, I actually had to go to the school's registrar, who was a notary public, and show the registrar my blank ballot. And then I would stand over here. Registrar could see that nobody was looking over my shoulder. Nobody was telling me what to do. I filled out my ballot. I sealed it. I signed on the envelope. She signed on the envelope, and we sent it back. Now, today, I think many states think, well, that's a pain. That's difficult. It's obviously not an easy process. But the purpose of those sorts of laws, witness laws, notary publics, was to try to recreate the privacy of the voting booth. If you could have some way where people could be out of town and vote and yet still be protected from a nosy neighbor, a spouse, a church, an employer, a union who might really have some sway over you, that was the goal. Now, some of these laws still exist, but you've started to see, of course, that they have faded away. And really in the late 1970s with California and many of the Western states following soon after, the thought was, well, absentee voting shouldn't be just for people who need it. It really should be a convenience. It should be available to all. And there are various steps in these processes, some of which is opening up and eliminating the reasons, eliminating the witness requirements or notary public requirements, allowing for people to have permanent absentee ballot status. A lot of these states took these steps along the way, but that was the beginning, I'd say, of when we started to move to a new era of a new level of people voting before Election Day. Really, once these laws that began in the 20th century got into place, we saw a pretty steady percentage of people who were voting by mail. It was about 5%. It was pretty similar from state to state. Again, it involved overseas voters, people out of town, people who were too sick or ill to come to the polling place. Starting in 1978, you see some states start to increase their percentages dramatically. And the voting by mail happens first. Voting by mail, again, in California, Oregon, now Washington State is 100% voting by mail. Start these processes, they start to expand. But then we also see, starting in the 80s, the beginning of the rise of voting early in person. Some of that had existed for a while in somewhat smaller ways at clerks' offices, but states making major efforts to have significant numbers of vote, especially in Texas and Tennessee, starting relatively early, it started to be a major factor. So now we have two types of voting before Election Day, and they are starting to add up. But the country is moving along at a different pace in different places. And so you start to see, especially the West, of course, much more vote by mail, some early voting in parts of the South, And some states, where at least when I wrote my book, it's gotten a little more jumbled now. Some states are really doing all of this. And today, I think you still see in states like New Mexico and to some extent Florida and Nevada, where you have a lot of different methods, lots of early voting, lots of voting by mail, lots of voting on election day. So lots of different types of voting. How dramatically has this increased? Well, I told Susan I wish I could come and tell you I have definitive numbers for 2012. They're very difficult to get quickly, and I think we could get you them in some months. We have state information from some states, but by the time I wrote my book, about 26% or so of people were voting early, before Election Day. More of them were absentee, by mail. 16% or so, 10% or so were voting early in person. That number increased to over 30% in the 2008 election, with early voting moving somewhat quicker, accelerating a bit more. Absentee voting still more of that, but voting by at polling places moving more quickly, or growth is more quickly. There were predictions certainly of 40% or so people voting before Election Day this election. I don't think that's going to come true. I have done some rough estimates. I don't really want to have you rely on them, because I think it relies on some guessing of some states and filling in some holes. But I think we're probably going to be more like 35% or somewhere in the mid-30s in terms of people who are voting early before Election Day. That's still a very, very significant change, from 5% in about 1980 to 35, still increasing percent today. So these are major parts of our election system, and really they're not going anywhere. So where should we go? I mean, my sense is that these are trends that are deeply ensconced. There are states that have moved deeply in different directions, and now Washington and Oregon State, are 100% vote by mail states. There may be some other states. You can imagine a Colorado, or perhaps a California, Arizona, some of the western states that have vote by mail. Not all making the decision now. Some of them consciously not making that decision. But as the number goes up, the incentive is to move to an all-mail voting system. I think that that may go forth in some states. You've also seen dramatic rises in early voting in places like Texas and Tennessee, but now in states like North Carolina and Georgia as well. So places that are really using that as the model, where we want most of our convenience voting to be in that realm. What's the reason that I am more favorable towards voting early in person as a method for broad-based convenience voting rather than voting by mail? Well, first, I think we have to look at one of the big promises that reformers talked about when instituting voting by mail or voting early in person. And for both of those reforms, the thought is it's convenient, it's easy, you remove the obstacles, therefore the voters will come, that there will be a rise in voter turnout. And there still is some debate, and I think you may hear in states that favor one version or the other that their state is really taken off in terms of voter turnout, but most of the research has shown that the turnout benefit is not really there from either method of this voting. There's an exception in lower turnout elections, in local type elections, very low salience elections. Then you do actually have the habitual voters who get a vote by mail ballot in the mail say, hey, I'm going to vote in that election. I might not have shown up at the polls. But for higher salience elections, for president, for statewide office, for congressional races, you do find basically it's the same people who would go to the polling place on Election Day who are casting ballots by mail or are going to polling places early. So that's probably not the reason to go in this direction, but clearly states are looking for a variety of reasons, and voters are looking for a variety of reasons for a certain amount of convenience, even if it doesn't mean more people are turning out. So both methods have a constituency, and election administrators have often some reasons for going in this direction, whether it is to smooth out the flow and not have everybody show up on Election Day, to allow a process that they feel more comfortable conducting the election. What else? I think if turnout is not the great panacea, why else am I worried about absentee voting? One is this reason that I started with, that you've lost the ability to have a purely secret vote. It's it doesn't seem like we're in the era of the 1890s or the era of big machine politics where pressures are so strong for people that they are coerced into voting. I think that's true that most of us don't have those pressures, but there are some who do. Those with the controlling spouse or work that, maybe even in a benign way says, look, it would be really good for us if you voted for that bond initiative, or maybe we should all get together. And one of the things about people like about absentee voting, voting by mail, is that they can often sit around the kitchen table and talk about things. I talked to a Colorado family recently, and they said, this is a great tradition for us. We sit around the table and we talk about voting. Well, this seemed like a very nice family, but you might find some families out there who aren't so nice and sit around the table and find a way to pressure your vote. One great thing about the secret ballot is that you can take all the pressures in the world, tell your people who are pressuring you, I'm with you, go into that polling place, close the curtain, and vote how you want, and that is the secret ballot. So there is this question of, are there some people out there really who will be finding themselves pressured to vote in a way that they wouldn't at the polling place, or they wouldn't at an early voting polling place, which has those protections. There certainly are transmission issues, and we do find hard to document lots of voter fraud in the United States, but the cases that we do find tend to be more in the absentee ballot realm. People who have found a way to either get ballots sent to them that don't belong to them, intercepted, thrown out, fiddled with ballots on the way out or on the way back. So there are some transmission issues. How does the ballot get from the voter back to the polling place? Can they do that securely? There's also the question of very early voting. I am not a purist about voting on Election Day. Some people are, and I think there is a civic spirit to showing up at the polls on Election Day. I think something like that might be found at early voting centers that allow you to vote a week before, 10 days before, you're voting with your fellow citizens. But absentee ballots, for very good reason, for overseas voters and others, sometimes need to be prepared early and necessary to vote early. Well, in some states, of course, you are able to vote that ballot 30 days before. And if you don't need to and you get that ballot and yet the debates haven't happened or some development hasn't happened, you're voting very early. Not a huge percentage of people vote very early, but a rising number of people are voting very early. What about the questions about whether the ballot is counted or not? We certainly see in places like Minnesota, where now they've, I think, made some significant reforms and unlikely to happen. But in a number of places, the question of whether local officials will count ballots, will follow state law. Not all states are going to tell you whether they counted their absentee ballot or not. The better states are going to do that. That's an issue. You don't know for sure whether your ballot will be counted, whether there will be a problem, whether you will have not put your name or the proper witness signature or the proper information on the envelope, and it may not be counted. And we don't have great numbers on that, but we certainly know that there's a percentage of ballots that are not counted that might have been had the voters shown up at an early voting site. And then some new research looking at voter errors on ballots. There's an argument that if you have more time to sit at your kitchen table, you're going to make fewer mistakes. On the other hand, at voting places, Election Day or early voting centers, you have error checking mechanisms, whether through DRE machines or OptiScan, where there are at least mechanisms that are going to make it much less likely that you overvote, spoil your ballot, or remind you if you're going to undervote. Some evidence that people are leaving more races blank, overvoting, making more mistakes, spoiling their ballots. Once they've voted the absentee ballot, no way really to get that back once it's been cast in that way. And finally, and again, this is not universal, but there's some evidence that in states with lots of absentee ballots that recounts are slower. I don't think they need to be necessarily. There's some policy questions that are related to why they're slower, but tend to have slower reporting rates on what the election results are, and if you have a disputed election, potentially takes longer to resolve. There are some positives. Again, I say people like it. Surveys show when you have voting by mail or you have early voting, the voters tend to embrace it. It certainly is convenient, and convenience isn't the same thing necessarily as more voter turnout, but people like the convenience, the ability to vote at different times in their schedule. Again, administrators might like it for evening the flow. And then finally, I will say, while, again, it's not my preferred method, if you look at Oregon and Washington State, which are 100% vote by mail, there is something to their argument that they treat voting by mail in a very professional way. It is their method of voting. Because of that, they have a more comprehensive way of checking signatures, contacting voters when ballots have arrived that aren't completed correctly, of trying to get them to help correct them beforehand. They spend all of their time and resources improving that system and making it professional. And so while, again, I wouldn't counsel a state to go in that direction, if it were sitting here today and was a low absentee, low early vote state, I'd probably say I'd rather see you move to early voting centers. There is a kind of professionalism that goes with the very, very high absentee states that say, look, that's my one method of voting. I don't have to deal with polling place voting. I can put all my resources there. So that is an argument, I think, that at the very top, the states that have gone all the way have in some ways started to do it better. I'm going to throw one last issue out there, and then I certainly want to hear your questions. And that's the question of cost. And I guess I would say I don't think we still really know the answer on that. If you talk to people in different states who have different systems, they will tout their own system. I've heard early voting state administrators say, look, it really is much cheaper to have early voting sites. Same thing in vote by mail states. It obviously depends a lot on the specifics. If you had a small percentage of people voting absentee, it actually might cost more to identify those voters. Are you able to get your early voting sites free from firehouses and public libraries or schools? Do you have to pay for them? Are you voting there for a week? Are you voting there for 3 weeks? There are a lot of things in the equation that I think make it very difficult for us to tell is one method more cost effective. And there have been some interesting new studies, and Pew has done some interesting work on this. But I don't think the jury has really decided yet which is a more efficient method cost-wise. So I think that's dependent very much on local conditions, and local administrators would have a better sense of which way they're going to go in that direction. So I guess the big point is, and I think most of you know this, you're out in the states, that we've really moved towards lots and lots of voting before Election Day. And that's not going back. We're not going back at any time soon. We're going to have a country that votes a very large percentage as a voting period, not really just on Election Day, one day, as we used to do for many, many years. And that has some advantages, and it has different looks in different states. But if I were a state looking to think about moving in this direction, thinking about early voting in person would be my recommendation, and to be cautious about making voting by mail the primary system of voting for domestic voters who don't need absentee ballots. So I will stop there, and I think I can see the clock and leave some time for questions. Should I just call on? Because I... Okay, I see one. If you want, I can repeat the question if for the. Okay, my wife tells me I have one too, so I think I'm okay even without this. Sure. Yes. Go ahead.
How do you feel about the fact that with early voting, you have ballots sitting around for a long time? And it's harder for the public to oversee as watchers because there are different times of counting that you don't have when you're counting everything in one evening.
It's a good question. I think the mic got that, but the question was really, with a spread out period of time for voting, how does that affect vote watchers, poll watchers, watching of the vote counting? I do think that there are issues on, if you have a solely Election Day issue, you have issues on that, and that you have many precincts, and some places where the parties find it difficult to get poll watchers at at polling places all across the state anyway. So I guess I'm not sure if the balance has changed dramatically. I do think there's one interesting issue with early voting in person, which I'm hoping technology resolves, but for the most part, we have some issues that are certainly we have big political issues, big political fights about if you have early voting, how long should it be and when does it stop? Especially in Florida, we had some question about the Sunday before Election Day. Typically, we'll have early voting for a period of time. It will stop sometime on the Saturday, maybe on the Sunday. So rarely is that early voting ever continue to the Monday, and then we'll have the Election Day on Tuesday. I think I'd like to see the day where there wasn't such a break, but the break is really necessary, as many of you will know, for essentially reconciling who's voted early and then being able to create poll lists for Election Day. With better real-time electronic poll books, that question may resolve itself over time, but I think right now we're going to be left with a period of time where we do have this break. And I think that is something that gets administrators worried about making sure that they have the time to have things in place for Election Day voting so that they have the integrity that they need for the system. So, in some ways, I think the counting, the parties can afford to get their poll watchers to over a somewhat longer period of time. I mean, most of the counting actually is not happening as the votes come in early at the early voting centers immediately. So I guess I don't think that's a major issue, but I will keep an eye on it. Want to go here? Okay. See, I'm probably going to favor people in the front because I can't see very well. So I'll rely on you to get people in the back next.
Which do you think is a greater concern, the challenges and difficulties posed by voting by mail and absentee voting in that method, or the disparate allocation of resources to various precincts and the potential barriers that our hyper-localized electoral system can put on certain voters from because of either manipulative local election officials or disparate partisan state politics?
Well, it is a good point that we have at both on Election Day and with early voting sites the question of where to locate polling places. And that's, as you know, a controversial one, both because people care about keeping their polling place and certain constituencies want voting near them, make it more convenient and more likely that their fellow voters near them will vote. And I suppose that is partly resolved by voting by mail, where there's more of an option. Look, I also think there is a move which I again think ultimately is where we should be going. Much of early voting, many places, is done at there are places where there's an option to vote at multiple locations, and I think that can mitigate the problem you're talking about. And in some ways we do have some research that shows some of these early voting centers that are sort of super centers have some turnout effects, positive turnout effects. One reason people think that is that if you locate a voting center in a Walmart, well, Walmart has done a lot of research as to where that Walmart should be and that it's visible from the highway, that it's on people's commuting patterns. So I do think that it is an issue about the siting of locations that would be somewhat mitigated by moving towards voting by mail. But if you have the movement towards the ability to vote at different places, which some states are certainly have moved in that direction, I think that would be a good future model, which would get away from some of those issues as well. Why don't we? You want to go back here, or well, I'll let you pick. Go ahead. Okay.
How do you know how many voters don't vote? Because for one reason or another. And also, have you consulted how the electors would like to vote?
So the second part of the question,
how would the electors like to vote? I mean, wouldn't they like to vote more conveniently, maybe from a cell phone, maybe from a laptop, right, maybe from any other means? Because the means we have present barriers.
It's a good question. The question is voter preference. I mean, I think that pretty clearly, we've had experiments where states who have moved to lots of voting by mail, and you survey people, they say, we really like this. This is a good method. It's convenient. We wouldn't want to give it up. If you move to states where they've moved to lots of voting early in person, they say the same thing. We like this method. We wouldn't want to give it up. So it's not clear to me that people have a preconceived notion of exactly the way in which they should vote, but they do seek convenience. And as I say, I would suggest the convenience of voting early in person. You asked about how we know who doesn't vote. Well, it's difficult. In fact, Michael McDonald is in the room, somebody who calculates this. It's more difficult in America to calculate this because we have a very decentralized system. And of course, we have surveys of people who don't vote. Some people say that there are aspects of the voting system that keep them from voting. I think registration still is one where if we worked more on that, there would be some turnout benefits. There's research that shows things like same-day registration actually does have positive turnout benefits. More clearly a reform in that direction than the kind of convenience voting for voting early or voting absentee. I guess I took turnout off the table essentially because the research is, kind of not so positive that these things really increase turnout as much as move voters around. Where some reforms like voting same-day registration actually does seem to have significant research that backs it up. So just because you make it somewhat easier, it seems easier, you've taken away obstacles, doesn't necessarily mean that more people will vote, and that's what the research has shown. Places that have moved in these directions, Oregon, for example, has had high turnout for a long time. Before it had voting by mail, it has high turnout now. It's not clear that that is the reason for its high turnout. Let's go back here.
Yes, in states like Oregon and Washington where it's all by mail, is it difficult to make election officials understand there's a certain number of voters, people in the military, people overseas who need to have their ballot sent to a different address, not the permanent home address, and have to be sent out significantly earlier than the big batch of ballots that are going out? Is that a problem? Do you have any data on that?
Yeah, if there's anyone from Oregon and Washington in the room, I don't want to speak against it. I actually generally think that Oregon and Washington do a pretty good job, and partly because they do a good job with their all-mail voting system domestically, they are sensitive to overseas voting in a certain sense. You certainly do see in the statistics, a certain percentage show up of people they consider kind of they actually consider everybody who votes by mail to be kind of in-person voting, and everybody else is absentee voting, and that's people who somehow need their ballot sent somewhere other than where they think they live. So there is a system for doing that. I just think generally they're well prepared to send out ballots, and so I have not assessed this in great detail, but my sense is that they are much more attuned to that in some ways than some other places because they're used to that from their regular system. We get another one here. Okay, we'll make this the last one.
Thank you. You spoke about the importance of the privacy of the ballot. In particular, you spoke about the importance of the privacy of the ballot as the person is voting. There's also the aspect of the privacy of the ballot as it's received by the local Board of Elections to make sure that no one knows how the ballot was voted when you're deciding whether to accept the ballot or not. And you spoke about personally how you sealed the back of the envelope and stuff. I understand that more and more ballots are being absentee-type ballots are being received that aren't in a separately sealed envelope, especially military and overseas. And I want to know what you think about this problem and how it can be solved, or and how big a problem it is.
Right. So I'm of two minds about. On the question of overseas voting, obviously we states have employed a number of methods that have less privacy than the system I laid out of signing your absentee ballot, including fax balloting and to some extent some email balloting. I'm cautious about those reforms. I mean, I certainly would be against those reforms as domestic measures to vote within a state for people who didn't need it. I'm sensitive to the fact that overseas voters have very special needs and problems and challenges, and so one should potentially use methods that I wouldn't support locally on that. Should states throw out ballots that are not sealed? Of course they shouldn't. I think that's something that states should be sensitive to votes that come in and be ultimately want to respect the wishes of the voter. I guess I'd like to see more emphasis on giving the voter the ability to have some degree of privacy. Even overseas, I'd like to see, if possible, ways of having people experiments in military locations where you could actually have something like a polling place where you could bring your uncast ballot and vote behind a screen if you wanted. Not the required method of voting, but I think absentee balloting is something that's necessary for people. It's needed, and yet it's not an ideal form of voting because of just the nature of it. It doesn't have all the protections of the polling place. So I don't know exactly why these ballots are coming in unsealed. I wouldn't throw them out, certainly, but it's again I think there's some sense in which we've forgotten the need to keep voters' intentions private. So I'd like to emphasize that again without making it too hard for the voters who absolutely need that vote to vote, who should have methods of being able to cast those ballots. All right, thank you.
Well, I see we've got lots and lots of issues, which is good news for the innovators in this room. We've got lots to do to make this better. So I really want to thank Dr. Fortier for helping us to understand the many issues around this form of voting. There's so many ways that it could improve. We don't have all the answers, but luckily we still have work. So, hey. All right. Thank you again. I guess the facility here didn't think you were cold enough. I'm really sorry about the temperature. I've reported it several times. They have said they've called it in. Unfortunately, modern technology is not always in our hands, and it is not a control panel that's in this building. So I'm so cold I can barely hold anything in my hands anymore, and I hope you're not as cold as I am. I'm sorry. But we'll hope for the best. All right, we're going to turn to our next session now, and I'm excited to say that you're going to hear about new highlights of our 2012 post-election research. Our next speaker is Dr. Claire Smith. She's made our research program what it is today. It's really an impressive body of election research. There's also an ongoing research newsletter program, and even more. Claire came to us with a PhD from Notre Dame, and she's got a work ethic and drive that really have led her to build a formidable program. She's taught at the University of Oldenburg in Germany and presented at the most prominent political science conferences. Today, you have the latest of her achievements in your hands. Let's welcome Dr. Claire Smith to tell us about the highlights of the post-election survey.
Oh, wow, you weren't kidding. It really is bright up here. Okay, so good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank everyone for coming today, and to John for your insightful comments. And I was sitting there and processing everything, and I realized when he was talking about security and coercion that I'm one of those people at the table. I'm married to a wonderful German man who takes his right to vote and privacy very seriously. And over the weekend, I was on the phone. There was a very important election in Germany. I said, who did you vote for? Who did you vote for? He didn't want to tell me. And finally, he told me. And so I feel really bad about that now. And if he's watching on the internet, I apologize. But as Susan mentioned, today I'm here to present and discuss OVF's 2012 post-election survey results. I do want to take a moment, though, as you can see, it's in our beautiful report, which is in your folders, that this is not a department of one. The research department grew this year, and I was lucky enough to work with some very talented people. We brought in an assistant researcher, Judy Murray. Alex Snyder is our new state information directory website guru, and Brian Leclerc, who I accidentally often call the brain when I'm writing emails too fast, who runs our research newsletter. So if you see them today, please introduce yourselves. Alex will probably be bugging the election officials to get updated information for our website. Brian will be bugging the academics to contribute to our newsletter. So yeah, please introduce yourselves. OVF's election surveys are very, very important because they're the only source of nonpartisan, non-government data about the overseas and military voting experience. They provide us valuable insight into the voting process, not only from the perspective of the voter, but from that of the election official as well. Data are important because it tells us what is working and what is not working so that we can know how to fix it. OVF is in its 5th general election cycle in creating these data. So not only do we have data from 2012, but we can now compare it over years, and that's wonderful. This year, we not only conducted our OVF voter and election official survey, but we also created a survey for U.S. voters and for the first time captured data on the domestic voting process. And we also worked with the state of Maryland to create a state-specific survey to find out and target specifically Maryland voters and find out what their experience was using their state website. It was an exciting project. We had a 30% response rate, which anybody who does surveys knows that that was just wonderful. So we look forward to pursuing this in the future and helping other states working with state surveys. I only have time today to go over the highlights of the data, but there's a lot more in the report, and as I said, we also have lots of copies of these. So if you'd like to take some for colleagues or people you know, or to read to your kids at bedtime, please just check the desk, and we've got plenty. Okay, now, okay, so that was me in the first slide. Wonderful. Okay. So as I mentioned, OVF's post-election voter survey is in our 5th form, and the LEO survey is in its 4th. Our surveys ran this year from November 6th to December 26th. So yes, on Christmas, I was sitting in front of my computer closing surveys. Also, what is important to know is that we are striving for increased professionalism in our survey program. We worked with Scott Huffman at Winthrop University in the Lab for Social and Behavioral Research, who provided us with consulting services and beta testing, so it's even better than ever. We once again had 2 samples for our voters. We sent out invitations to OVF users and opened up an open URL to allow people to respond to the survey. We had over 13,000 respondents, a 14% response rate. And I'm also happy to report that we had our best ever open URL response. So we were able to really draw in more people to the survey. In our local election survey, we sent out over 7,000 invitations to local election officials that we have in our election official directory. Thankfully for Jane, who runs that for us. If you meet her, also shake her hand. She's wonderful. And we had over 2,000 respondents, a 27% response rate, which is the best we've ever had. And in fact, I had wonderful election officials sending me surveys last week who they want to share their experiences with us. So I think I might even update the report and put that on the web with the new data that we've been getting in since. So please look for that on the website. Now, there was a lot of information to sift through. And I thought to myself, how can I make this interesting? What is it that people want to know? And it really came clear to me that what we want to know is what happened with the MOVE Act in 2012. The passage of the MOVE Act in October 2009 was really the first major policy change for overseas and military voters in more than a decade. The key provisions of MOVE targeted technology, communication, and election administration. Now, in 2010, states were first implemented it, but this was our first presidential election in which we could really see full implementation across the board. So the question really is, what happened? And today I'm going to look at 6 very specific aspects of the MOVE Act, the first 2 of which address one of the primary issues of overseas and military voting, in that it just takes too long to vote. Now, it's interesting because the MOVE Act did this in 2 ways, by fundamentally thinking about when we send ballots and how we send ballots. The first of these was when ballots are sent. And for 60 years, dating back to the Truman administration, there was a call to transmit ballots 45 days before the election. And this recommendation was finally implemented in the 2010 MOVE Act. The first sign that this is working, I think that we've seen many, many positive trends, is that more people are actually getting their ballots. That sounds a little bit mundane, but it's really important. You have to get your ballot before you can vote. And in 2012, 81% of respondents reported that they received their ballots. This is a 5% increase from 2008. As we can see from the table, it's really small. I apologize for that because of the way we uploaded it into the system. However, all of these tables are also in the report, so you can look it up there. Is that if you look from 2008 going across 2012, the numbers of people getting their ballots the week before the election or even after the election is going down from 9% to 4% to 2%. So not only are people getting their ballots, they're getting their ballots with enough time to vote. It's also interesting that more voters reported sending their ballots back earlier, actually putting them in the mail before October 15th, which is really important because that gives the post about 2 to 3 weeks to deliver it on time. All of these are very positive trends. However, despite this positive improvement, 22% of the respondents who tried to vote could not because their ballot was missing or it came too late. 22%, I would like that to be 0%, but 22% is very positive considering it was over 40% in 2008. So I think that everybody deserves a little bit of a pat on the back for that. However, it was interesting when you look at the data is that this is not necessarily a problem of ballots going out late to election officials. We've called upon election officials to send their ballots out on time, but we now really need to reach out to voters and encourage them and stress to them they must send their forms in on time. If you send in a request form 3 days before the election, you might not be able to vote on time. So one of our recommendations is always outreach is key and making sure voters know that they have to send those forms in on time. The second element of the MOVE Act that really impacted how we vote is on how ballots are sent. And this was the requirement for election registration and ballot requests and blank ballots. What was interesting in 2012 is there was full compliance across the board. All states and election officials had some sort of electronic transmissions for ballots. And what we're going to see in the next coming slides is that 2012, if you take anything away from this presentation, is that 2012 was a tipping point in the use of technology. Let's look at the process of voting. If you look at registration options, the first thing we saw is these are voters and how are they using paper or electronic versus non-electronic methods. If you look at completing forms, you'll see the blue. It's all about the differences between the blue and the red, but in a very good way today. Is that electronic methods were 84% of completing their ballots. People are going to the internet to figure out a way to download their registration forms. This is really, really important. It's the highest that we've seen since we started tracking this. However, if you look at returning their forms, it's only 36%. So I might go to the internet and download my form and fill it out, but I'm still putting it in the post when I sent that. Postal methods are the most important form of returning forms. The number of respondents using electronic methods to return forms, although it continues to grow. It's 36% now. It was 18% in 2008, 30% in 2010. So there is a trend there, but it's growing at a smaller pace than the rest of it. So that's registration. What happens with balloting? And this, when I was looking at the data, in my small office in Germany, I almost jumped up. For the first time, those who received their ballots, over 50% reported receiving a ballot via electronic methods. This is, if you look, the red is non-electronic, so postal methods. The blue is electronic methods. What's interesting is 5% reported receiving 2 ballots, one electronically and one paper. So there appears to be a small issue about who's getting what ballot and when. When we break down the electronic methods, the most common form of transmitting an electronic ballot was email with a PDF file. Fax, you mentioned fax, but for the first time, it was almost non-existent in the data. It was both election officials and voters, almost no one reported using fax anymore, which I always found interesting because nobody I know owns a fax anymore. So if that's how people are getting their ballots, how are they returning their ballots? And we could see the overwhelming red portion, 85% are using non-electronic methods to send their ballots back. They're going through the post. Only 15% are using an electronic method to transmit a voted ballot. The low percentage of individuals using electronic methods to return voted ballots is probably due to the limitations within the states. Only over just about 19 states allow this, so I think that that's one of the reasons why people are not pursuing it as much. Now, let's put it all together, those pie charts, and look at the flow of the voting process, and you can see clearly here how electronic methods are beginning to take over paper and postal methods in the voting process. However, what's interesting is that voters are clearly not as confident in sending forms or voted ballots with private information electronically, which is a good thing, because we should always hold a skepticism about security issues and privacy. OVF recommends that all forms be sent through the post. What is also interesting, though, in this data is that if you look at it over time, because I have data since starting in 2004, is that it's solidified. 2012 truly was a tipping point in the use of technology. It is here, and it is not going away. Now, what's interesting is it's important to note that technology sometimes comes with a downside. People are happier, they're getting their ballots, they're voting on time, but there is a downside to the use of technology. New solutions come with new problems. What is the good news of this slide is that the number of problems that were reported were relatively small. Only about 7% of voters who got electronic ballots reported problems. But it was interesting the types of things that they reported. Paper size, computer compatibility issues, PDF files were especially problematic. When we were creating this question for the survey, I had to sit down and think of all of the things that could go wrong with a PDF file. It was a big list. And so this is really one thing, especially because it's the most common method, that we really need to consider what are the problems that we have with PDF files and how can we fix those. What was also interesting was the envelope issue, because often there are very specific instructions about how to create an envelope, and then folding up information in 2 envelopes into each other. We get very great comments from our voters, and one wrote to me, "You need a PhD in origami in order to fold up the papers and prepare the ballot for submission." And this is true. Based on these results, OVF makes the recommendation that technology and usability issues must be addressed now before they become systemic and widespread. One of these elements is having adequate tech support for election officials, either on the local level or on the state level. When we asked people, where did you go for tech support, the majority said they went to their friends. So it would be nice if there was also that support then from the election official side as well. Now, what was interesting is one of the most common questions that OVF receives, both in our help desk and even through the survey open comment questions, is how can I be sure that my ballot was received? Now, the MOVE Act tried to address this. They sought to help voters and improve the quality of the voting experience by having states establish online tracking systems. The majority of election officials reported having these tools. We can see that either they were on the local website or 56% had it on their state website, which should be commended. This is an increase over 2010. There is more widespread compliance with this element of the MOVE Act. Unfortunately, voters don't seem to know about them. When we asked, only 28% of voters used a registration lookup tool, and only 13% used a ballot tracking tool. I was wondering why this was, and then I looked through the open comments on our survey. There were lots of people writing in, really, this exists? Where can I find it? Some people even wrote to my private OVF email address, and I was helping them on election day. I was like, what state are you from? And I would send them the link so that they could look it up. And this goes back to our outreach is key. Voter outreach is essential to informing individuals about the innovative tools available to them. Some of this is simple things like website optimization. How many links does it take to get to the ballot tracking tool? How many barriers do I have to cross before I can find this information? It's a small solution that will help voters, and then it's really great for election officials. They should be commended for doing this great work for voters. So now we've got to make sure that the voters actually know about them and start using them. One of the interesting things about the MOVE Act was that it showed a trend and responded to a trend in overseas and military voting about online communication. It asked that all election officials establish an online communication with voters. And if we compare 2010 to 2012, you see the blue get very, very big. So the primary form of communication between election officials and voters has now become email, increasing from 58% in 2010 to 2012%, up to 73% in 2012, excuse me. So the use of email as a form of communication has solidified. In 2010, election officials were a little bit skeptical about this, but in 2012 they were more optimistic, and 89% said that they feel that email works well. I just wanted to say there is a piece of like gray pie in 2012 that says 13% other. And if you look at that data, that's websites. A lot of election officials are not just email, but moving towards websites and this type of online communication to also communicate with their voters. We come to probably one of the more controversial aspects of the MOVE Act, and that was creating a single application for each election. Before the MOVE Act, election officials were required to honor an application for 2 general election cycles or 4 years. This often led to confusion and difficulties for election officials who would send out ballots to addresses that were no longer valid. Unfortunately, we saw in 2012, and it emerged again in 2010 and emerged again in 2012, that this aspect of the MOVE Act has been confusing and inconsistent in its implementation. Some states are requiring that you either do one at the beginning of the year or even apply for a ballot for every election you want to participate in. So if you're going to be in a primary, or if you're going to be in a runoff election, or if you're going to vote in a general election, that every time that you want to vote, you have to send in an application form. If we look at this data is from election officials. We can see from 2008, 58%, 7%, 53%, and then there's a drop. 22%. So those who had registered in 2010 receiving ballots without filing. So people were requested to file another form. But what's interesting here is you see in 2012, 22%, 24%, 24%. That's indicating that it's not consistent across the board who has to do what to get a ballot. And this also then led to, well, my friend from state so-and-so doesn't have to do that. And so this has led OVF to the conclusion to make the recommendation that the application provision should be reinstated so the FPCA is valid over 1 complete general election cycle, and that 2, it must be uniform for both military and civilian voters. Finally, the last aspect of the MOVE Act, we've got so much that we've looked at today, is the expansion of the federal write-in absentee ballot. Once again, this is small, but like I said, it's also in the book, so you can look it up later. I was so happy for the first time since we started tracking this data in 2004, that the awareness, just knowing what an FWAB is, that's the question, are you aware of the FWAB, reached over 50%. So I think everybody, election officials and voters, should be commended for finally getting the awareness over 50%. Unfortunately, we saw an interesting trend in some of the election official data. And that was election officials reported that many people were sending FWABs who were not eligible to use one. Because in many states, you have to send in an FPCA and request your ballot before you are eligible to use an FWAB. People either did not know that or they were misinformed, and they were sending in FWABs anyway. Which is why we recommend further study of the FWAB across states be conducted so that we know the information through websites, widgets, and states that people are getting, what is the source of this misinformation, and how can we make our outreach better so that those who can use an FWAB are using it correctly. Now, there were lots of things in this year that made me so happy, and one of those is that we had our highest ever military voter response rate. One of the problems is we tap well into the civilian voters, and military voters are sometimes a little bit more hesitant to answer the survey. But this year, we had almost 600 military respondents, which was wonderful. And as I broke the data out to see how are military voters different from civilian voters, what's happening to them, we realized that military voters have very unique circumstances. One of the biggest problems for a military voter is, how am I going to receive my ballot? So perhaps I decide I wanted a paper ballot. Well, this year there was a plane crash in Afghanistan that had ballots on it. So that was your paper ballot. And then I want an email ballot with a PDF file, but unfortunately there are security filters on military email addresses, so ballots weren't coming through that way. So there really is almost a catch-22 of how can we get, in a secure way, military voters their ballots on time. It's different for civilians. I live in a small town in Germany, but the Deutsche Post is very reliable. So I know that my stuff is going to move on time. And this is something that needs to be looked at in a better way. What was also interesting about military voters is they were more likely to use an online ballot tracking system or a voter registration lookup tool than a civilian voter. For some reason, they seem to be more aware of these types of tools. I'm not going to interpret that data. I'm just going to sort of leave it hanging for now. But we've got a whole panel on military issues later in the afternoon, and I hope that they'll bring this up about why this awareness seems to be amongst military voters. So I've thrown a lot of stuff at you. If you're feeling overwhelmed, just read the report at your leisure. But there are three conclusions I hope you take from this presentation today. One, 2012 certainly was a tipping point in the use of technology. It is here, and it is here to stay. However, new solutions create new problems that we must begin to address before they become larger problems. And three, outreach is still the key. Voters need to know what are their options and when can they do it. I like to say it's almost like a marriage where people are arguing with each other. There's an election official on one side and there's a voter on the other side. We have to figure out how to work together to make this process better for everyone. And before I leave, there was one thing that I thought was interesting in some of the younger voters. We had a lot of younger voters this year, as you saw from Susan's presentation. And in the open comments section of our survey, a lot of them were saying, I want an I voted sticker. You know, there really is a civic feeling for overseas voters. I don't know if it's possible in a paper ballot to just stick a sticker in there, but I know that a lot of overseas voters would really appreciate that one small thing. OVF also has a Facebook page, and we had an I voted virtual sticker, and it was our most popular link in all of 2012. So, you know, something to think about as you're having your coffee later this afternoon. I think that's it. I don't know, are we going to take questions, or Susan? Okay. Then, well, okay. But if you have any questions, please feel to find me.
Thank you so much, Claire. And sorry about the limit on questions. We ran a little bit behind with the snow, but that'll give us something to talk about later. I'd like to now turn to U.S. vote. About a year ago, almost exactly to the day, at Summit 2012, we showed the audience this video.
At Overseas Vote Foundation, we have a mission to help register overseas and military voters by giving them the best online tools to get the job done. And at OVF, we have a vision that every U.S. citizen is a voter. Our strategy is to use technology and research to improve the complicated overseas voting process. However, the complications are not just overseas. In the U.S., every state has its own dates, deadlines, and requirements for voter registration. It's most effective to use your own state form, which contains the information your election official needs to get you on the voting roll. Wouldn't it be great to get help to register using your state-specific form? Overseas Vote Foundation now provides an answer for U.S. domestic voters. Welcome to U.S. Vote Foundation. We bring you action, information, and answers. The most effective way to register to vote. Here for you today. U.S. Vote Foundation.
And we did it. We launched state-specific voter registration at that time and a full-service website. And then we moved to our second development phase, which was right around mid-year. It culminated mid-year when we launched state-specific absentee ballot request. And now, in that process of analyzing and programming each state's registration flow and forms, I couldn't really help but feel like I was reliving the past. Something about Uokava kept coming up in my memory. In the process, we also learned that the states had very broadly differing requirements and eligibility for absentee balloting, and that 14 states didn't even have forms to request an absentee ballot. So in those cases, we programmed the production of a letter. And then we got a call from one state that wanted to let us know that, according to their legislation, no computer could help anybody write a letter. So we wrote instructions to help the voter write a letter for that. Anyway, all in all, I could summarize it by saying that the U.S. absentee ballot request process, it's kind of like pre-move Uokava on steroids. And the hallmark is really non-uniformity in the requirements and in the forms. We just use some design smarts and our software engine to get around that and make it more accessible for the voters. In the end, about 100,000 visitors came to U.S. Vote in its first year, and 10,000 completed registration and absentee ballot requests. Then we sent these voters invitation to the U.S. Vote survey. About 11% of them actually responded, and that was great, but we still feel it's a beginning. The satisfaction levels, in general, they really measured about the same as with Uokava voters, 76%, which I really quite find perplexing. People have a hard time knowing what's possible, so they're really satisfied. I think if they knew what was possible, they wouldn't be so satisfied, but we'll have to see. Overall, about 60% of the visitors to our U.S. Vote survey, the respondents, had voted as absentee ballot voters or absentee voters. Now, in contrast to the 35% of the Uokava voters that use online methods to submit ballot requests, only about 15% of the domestic voters did so, or the respondents to the survey. They're still really largely using post. This isn't, however, giving much of a different result in terms of the ballot receipt. That's pretty much equivalent across the two groups. It's 14%, or right around there. So that's voters, those voters, those 14, just to be very specific, are not receiving the ballot that they requested. It also seems like in the U.S., the absentee ballot requests, because there are no kind of guidelines like we have around UOCAVA and nobody's pushing for early application, it seems very much like a last-minute option. The voters maybe realize they can't go to the polls or that they don't want to go to the polls, rush for an absentee ballot, and they're mainly requesting their ballots in October. Nearly 50% of them received their ballots in the last half of October. Now, that's probably something John Fortier likes, because they're not voting in September or something horrible like that. And, you know, that's a good point. I think that there's a balance to this. We don't want to rush everything out. So that's something to examine, I think, over time. But ultimately, what we saw was that amongst the registration forms, about a third of the registration forms and two-thirds of the absentee ballot requests were submitted in October. We saw another very encouraging statistic, and that was that 97%, or a little over 97% of the respondents told us that they actually returned the absentee ballot that they were sent. So they are using it. Some further results or thoughts, however, to add to the survey results are more a reflection on our experience. What we've seen is over the years, a lot of significant and meaningful investments have been made in technology and system development, in election administration procedures, and in reporting, and most all of this, and I mean supported at the federal level. This has been to support the UOCAVA absentee voting process across all states. Overseas and military voters are benefiting from the uniformity of UOCAVA. They've got one standardized form across all states. That same form will function as a simultaneous voter registration and absentee ballot request, something that doesn't exist to our knowledge in any, for any domestic purpose. They also have an emergency write-in ballot in the event that the requested ballot doesn't arrive. And what I'd like to propose is that we start to seriously think about maximizing these investments, about looking at them. Perhaps they're one of the fastest ways to improve U.S. absentee balloting. As a result of the MOVE mandates, UOCAVA voters now enjoy convenience of online ballot request, at least a form generation, and different levels of it in different states, but also electronic methods for blank ballot delivery and online ballot tracking systems. I would venture to say that as an overseas voter, it's easier to vote absentee than it is here in the U.S. to vote as an absentee voter, by far. The mandates have had really positive impacts on the voting process. We're going in the right direction. Fewer registration and ballot request forms are being rejected, and more voters are receiving their ballots in a timely manner. These investments have been made, and I leave with you the thought that perhaps it's time to broaden our use of them. I'm going to transition now. We're right on time here. I don't want to keep you from your break. It's a chance to warm up with some hot coffee. But I do want to take a tiny bit of time for something that we squeezed in here. I mentioned that we did a video with the state of Minnesota, and this would be a perfect time to show it because it just shows what's possible in terms of outreach and what's possible when we work together with states. And also, it gives a vision of how we need to educate voters, and it's just one way to do it. Here we go.
Overseas citizen and military absentee voting is a simple, interactive process that you, the voter, can successfully navigate. It gives you a way to participate in U.S. elections, no matter where you are in the world. Some steps you do, some your election official does. At each step, we have tools to help you. Start the process of applying for your ballot by entering your data into the voter registration application. You can save your data in a voter account for future use. Once this form is completed, It will also serve as your absentee ballot request. Indicate how you intend to submit the form. Your state's options may include email, fax, or post. Download the completed form and instructions. Print and sign it. The mailing address of your election office prints with your instructions. Remember, you haven't requested your ballot until you submit your request to your election official, either by post, email, or fax. Even if you transmit your form electronically, you should always follow up by sending the printed, signed original form by post. Your election official needs your original signature on file. Send it off right away. Your election official will process your registration ballot request form and put you on the voter roll. Check the election official directory for contact details and to find the online ballot tracking system for your state. Your ballot will be sent to you either online or by post. Complete your ballot and sign the envelope. This is your vote. Now make sure your vote is counted. Send your ballot back to your election official before the deadline. Congratulations, you're now an overseas absentee voter. Time to get started.
So that was fun. With that, I'd like to request that Chip Levengood, our chairman, come up and present a couple of awards that we have. Thank you.
It is bright here. It's blinding. Excuse me, I need glasses because otherwise I won't be able to get the words out correctly. As Susan said, my name is Chip Levengood, and I'm the chairman. I promise not to eat into your break time very much because I know that both coffee and warm temperature will be good. As the chairman of OVF, one of the great honors I have is to present our annual awards for meritorious service to UOCAVA voters. In this season of Oscars and Tonys, within OVF, we like to call these awards the Susans, in tribute to our indefatigable CEO. Wikipedia calls our first recipient an American social entrepreneur, media commentator, and political activist. I'm also honored to count him as a friend of OVF and as a member of our advisory board. Please join me in saluting Matt Siegel as we ask him to come forward. I can't see whether Matt's in the...
I'm not sure if Matt's here.
Okay.
He's young and he's not usually on time.
Okay. Can you get the bag? Can you get the bag with the...
I have everything.
Oh, okay.
But is anyone else here from our time? And if not, we'll...
Is someone else here from our time who might receive the award in Matt's stead? If not, we'll continue to...
Well, we can give it to him later.
We will give it to him later, but just let me make sure you understand why we've chosen to honor Matt in this way. Most of the previous award winners have been long laboring champions for UOCAVA voting rights like Pat Hollern or Admiral Jim Carrey. Our recognition of Matt today underscores the huge impact on the political landscape by younger voters, a group to whom OVF has reached out through our dedicated website, Youth Vote Overseas, and our 2012 partnership with the National Association of Private Universities and Colleges through domestic subsidiary U.S. Vote, which Susan talked about. But Matt has given us invaluable guidance and insights during our journey. His own journey has been noteworthy and rich in accomplishments. I shall cite just a few. Founding SAVE, Student Association for Voter Empowerment, while still a junior at Kenyon College. Co-founding 80 Million Strong for Young Americans Job Creation, spearhead job creation and economic development, and combining SAVE with Declare Yourself, a voter registration NGO, to form Our Time. Our Time is dedicated to bringing economic power to Matt's generation. He's ever mindful that one of the paths to power is through the ballot box. Many of you have seen and heard Matt at previous summits. He's also a regular commentator on the Huffington Post, MSNBC, and other media outlets as a spokesperson for Americans under 30. Please join me in applauding Matt as he receives his award. And we'll certainly let him know that there was a vigorous round of applause when we do. The second honoree with us, Susan, is a tireless champion of extending voting rights for previously underserved voting populations, initially with rural Minnesotans and since being elected Secretary of State in 2006 with Uocava voters. Please recognize the Honorable Mark Ritchie as he comes forward to receive his award. You get to stand here while I say a few words about you.
Maybe we should let Mark say a few words.
Over the years since OVF's founding in 2005, Mark has been a true inspiration in helping us to understand the needs and the means to enhance the Uocava voter services and outreach. His leadership is not limited to words. Mark is a man of action. His action importantly includes the intelligent introduction of technology to remove obstacles to broadened Uocava participation while maintaining the integrity of the voting process, both of which are very important elements. In 2007, shortly after Mark had been elected, he found no online services to encourage overseas and active duty Minnesotans to vote. So this man of action reached out to Michael Cauto-Fagan at the Pew Charitable Trusts and implored Michael to fund our fledgling organization. As they say, the rest is history. With initial financial support from Pew, OVF, in partnership with Minnesota, rolled up our sleeves and we went to work. The results are, I hope you will agree, impressive. The Minnesota website, powered by OVF software, supported in 2012 15,500 Uocava voters to produce ballot requests or substitute FWAB blank ballots with an 85% completion rate, which is a wow factor. Earlier this morning, you saw some of the new technology and tools used to achieve this. And I just want to close by saying Mark has been a genuine leader in improving the voting experience for absentee voters, and thus we're very proud to have presented him with this year's Susan Award for Meritorious Service. Thank you.
Thank you. I have the microphone soon where I'll get to talk a little more, but I want to say that the real success from OVF's help for us has been that we've consistently had a higher success rate with our overseas voters in absentee as we have for domestic, and that's been since we've been partners with OVF. But for both domestic and overseas voters, military and others, our success rate is now over 99%, and that's because of OVF's help with this process. So thank you very much, and thank you for this award.